Hello biology students, and welcome to our new unit, which is going to be on the cardiovascular or the circulatory system. I want to start out in this video mainly looking at the heart, which is the main organ of the circulatory system. Okay, so before we get into the heart, it's always important when we start a new system to talk about what the function of that system is. So the function of the circulatory system is basically to transport things around the body. And you find that organisms that have circulatory systems have them because at some point their bodies become too large or too complex for diffusion alone to spread things around the body. So if I have a very, very small organism, like a single-celled organism, I don't need a circulatory system because diffusion alone can transport things around that organism's body. Okay? So our circulatory system transports things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, and other materials. So there are some other kind of less intuitive functions to the circulatory system as well. So one of them is that it regulates body temperature. And if you kind of think about it, when you're really, really cold, you look almost white. And when you're hot, oftentimes you look kind of red. And this is because as you get hot and as you get cold, your blood vessels, which are holding your blood, will constrict, meaning they get smaller, or they'll dilate, meaning they'll get bigger, to basically allow more or less blood to get to the surface of your body. You got to think, the closer blood is to the surface of your body, the more heat it's going to release. So if you're very cold, your blood vessels constrict, they get smaller. That's going to decrease, this should be a down arrow, that's going to decrease blood flow. And therefore, because the blood's not as close to the surface, not as much heat is going to leave your body. So it's going to decrease your heat loss. Conversely, when you're very hot, your blood vessels will dilate, increasing blood flow to the surface of the body. And now because blood is close to the surface of your body, you're going to lose heat from that blood, which is going to increase your heat loss. And finally, a third function is it carries white blood cells around the body. And remember, white blood cells are a cell type that helps to protect us from disease. They're an immune cell from our immune system. Okay, so the circulatory system can be broken into two main sections. The cardiovascular system, which we're going to be focusing on for many videos, and the lymphatic system. It's two kind of sets of tubes through your body that transport things. The cardiovascular system is made up of blood vessels in the heart, or the lymphatic system is made up of lymph vessels, and lymph nodes. So we're going to stick with the cardiovascular system for now, and we'll get to the lymphatic system later on in the unit. Okay, so the heart is the main organ of the cardiovascular system, and there are going to be several parts of the heart you're going to have to know. Just looking at this heart right now, you can see that there are 4 main chambers. There are little valves, which are kind of like doors, in between these chambers, and there are blood vessels that stick off the chamber. So those are the main parts, and we're going to learn the different names of each different parts. Okay, so let's start with some of the main sections. The first, the pericardium. If you were to pull a heart out of a person right now, you would see that heart would be surrounded in this little, very thin sac. You can see this person who's detecting a heart here is kind of lifting up the sac there. And that sac that protects the heart is called the pericardium. And then if you kind of slice the heart in half, you see the heart is made up of very, very thick walls of muscle. And this muscle is called the myocardium. And the job of the myocardium is to pump blood throughout the circulatory system. You can kind of think we need nice, strong muscle if we're going to be able to pump blood all throughout the entire body. Okay. Now, in fact, this myocardium works really hard. The heart does quite a bit of pumping. In fact, in average, the heart pumps 72 times per minute, pumping 70 milliliters of blood each time. So therefore, in one in 1 year, your heart could pump enough blood to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So it works quite hard for your entire life. Okay, so now let's break down and look at some of these parts here. So the first part you have to know is the septum, which is this wall of muscle right here that divides the left side of the heart from the right side of the heart. The next main parts are the chambers. So the upper chambers, so this chamber right here and this chamber right here, the two upper chambers are called atria, which is singular as atrium. And then the lower chambers are called the ventricles. Okay? And basically, the way these chambers work, let me just erase for a second, is the atria receive blood from somewhere, So, maybe here's the rest of my body. And the body dumps blood into the atria, okay? And then the atria gives the blood to the ventricle, okay? And on the other side receives, this atria receives blood from the lungs, and then that atria dumps blood to the ventricle. So the atria receive blood from other parts of the body, and then they pump the blood to the ventricles. That's the way that works. So a nice memory trick you could use to remember which chambers are the atria, which are the ventricles, that if I drew a heart, you could see that the pointy end of the heart, on the bottom, is kind of like the pointy V for ventricle. Those are on the bottom. Where the top rounded part of the heart has a nice rounded A. Okay? So that helps you remember which one's on the top or which one's on the bottom. That's fantastic. Okay. So now, one confusing thing to think about is that when we're looking at the heart, we're talking about left and right. We're talking about the person whose heart it's their left and right. So if you're looking at it, you can look, the right is actually on our left, and the left is on our right. So we can call this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the left atrium, and this is the left ventricle. And it turns out the atria function as one unit and the ventricles function as one unit. So when the right atria is pumping, the left atria is also pumping. And when the right ventricle is pumping, the left ventricle is also pumping. They act as a unit. Okay, so now in between my chambers, I have these flaps of tissue called valves, and they basically control the flow of blood. I have two types of valves. The first type is called the atrioventricular valves, and that name makes sense because these are the valves that are found between the atrium and the ventricles. Okay? So the valve between the right atria and the right ventricle, right here, is called the tricuspid valve. And the valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. Okay? And then the other type of valve we have are the semilunar valves, and they're called this because they're kind of shaped like half crescent moons. Okay? And they are at the exits of the ventricles. So if you look, here I have my right ventricle. Now when the blood exits this, it's going to go out this structure right here. So the valve found right there, that's called the pulmonary valve because it's the valve between this ventricle and the pulmonary artery. Okay? And then finally, the other semilunar valve is the one between this ventricle and this vessel is called the aorta. So this valve right here is called the aortic valve. Okay, it prevents blood from going backwards into the left ventricle. Okay, so now finally, let's look at the names of a couple of the blood vessels, and then that will be it for structures of the heart. So first, the vessel right here. So here I have my body, and remember the body is going to have used up a bunch of oxygen. So now I'm going to have deoxygenated blood. The blood is going to enter the heart via the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So it's going to go into this atria right here through this vessel and this vessel. The top half of the body will give blood through the top, and the bottom half of the body will give blood through the bottom. So the superior and inferior vena cavas bring blood there. Okay, so the blood that enters the right atrium, and then the right atrium is going to send blood to the right ventricle. So from there, the right ventricle is going to contract, it's going to squeeze, and it's going to force blood to the lungs. And the reason this is important is because right now we have deoxygenated blood, so we need to send it to the lungs so it can pick up oxygen. So it's going to go out through the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary means lungs. And if you look, there are two branches. That's because it can go to the left or the right lung. Okay? So then once it gets to the lungs, carbon dioxide leaves the blood, and as you breathe in, oxygen enters the blood. So we swap out CO2 for oxygen. Okay? So next, now I have oxygenated blood. So now you can kind of see it's colored red in this picture. If you see these little vessels right here, these come back from the lungs. Okay, and they dump blood into the left atria. And then the left atria gives its blood to the left ventricle. And now we're ready to send that blood to the rest of the body so the oxygen can be used. So the left ventricle pumps the blood out the aorta, which is the artery that goes to the rest of the body. the biggest artery in your body. And this is a very strong contraction. If you look, this muscle is very, very thick because this contraction has to bring blood to the entire body. Okay, so to kind of summarize, deoxygenated blood, that oxygen has been used, comes in through the superior and inferior vena cava, enters the right atrium where it enters the right ventricle, the tricuspid valve. Then it goes through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary arteries where it goes to the lungs to get oxygen, comes back from the lungs after it has oxygen, and enters through the pulmonary veins, goes into the left atria, goes through the bicuspid or the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then through the aortic valve to the aorta to the rest of the body. Okay, so this heartbeat, heart contraction is really important because it's pumping blood around to your body and to your lungs to circulate that oxygen and nutrients. So it's very important that heartbeat is controlled. Okay? So the heartbeat is actually controlled by a section of the heart itself called the SA node. There's a bundle of nerves right here called the SA node that stimulates the heart muscle cells around that area to contract. So the SA node sends a signal. Okay? So the SA node is a group of specialized cells between the superior vena cava and the right atrium, and it regulates the contractions of the heart. So it generates a signal that causes the atria to contract. So this is often called the pacemaker because it determines the pace of our heartbeat. So after when the SA node fires, that's telling the heart to contract. And what it does is that signal is sent to another bundle of nerves called the AV node, which is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then this bundle of nerves sends a second signal, and that tells the ventricles to contract. So you can kind of think the SA node tells the atria to contract, and the AV node tells the ventricles to contract. Okay, so we get a signal from the SA node causing the atria to contract, so the blood in the two atria go down to the two ventricles. And then that signal gets to the AV node, and that sends a signal telling the ventricles to contract, which pumps blood out of the two ventricles into the pulmonary artery and into the aorta. So this rhythmic contraction of the atria first and then the ventricles creates what we call the cardiac cycle. So we have two main parts of the cardiac cycle. We have diastole, and you can think of diastole, it's kind of complicated, but you can think of it as when the heart is relaxed. When the heart's relaxed, the AV valves are open, so the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, and blood is flowing from the veins into the heart. And at this point, all four chambers are filling up. The atria fill up all the way, but the ventricles only nearly fill up. What happens next is after diastole, we have systole. And here's where we're basically going to get the atria to contract, and that's going to force any blood in the atria into the ventricles to fill them completely. Then, in the second half of systole, the ventricles are going to contract, and that's going to close the AV valves, so that way blood can't go from the atria to the ventricles anymore. And it's going to open up the semilunar valve, so now blood is pumped out of the ventricles. So distole, the whole heart is relaxed, and during systole, the atria contract and then the ventricles contract. So it's kind of cool. This can actually explain where your heartbeat comes from. You know that lub-dub sound that your heartbeat makes? Really what you're hearing is the AV valves closing after the ventricles fill up. That's the lub. And then the dub, the second sound, is the semilunar valve slamming shut. So really what you're hearing is the valve slamming shut. That's what your heartbeat is. And the closing of this valve prevents blood from flowing backwards, which is pretty important. Okay, so that's it for video 1, and I'll see you in video 2.